the plug-in hybrid electrics, the barrier is primarily that we are concerned with the range and the costs associated with those vehicles. So I think that barrier is, market driven and is definitely, starting to improve. And we see that, I think, probably in the next 2 years, we're going to be able to convert many of our plug-in hybrids to all electric EVs. And then along with that is destination charging and en-route charging for our state employees when they get an electric vehicle at one of our hubs where we have charging. They have to, travel all over the state, and they can only take an all-electric vehicle if they know that they're going to be able to charge it somewhere else. In terms of the charging side, we have 30 fleet dedicated chargers and 6 public chargers. And some of those are dual port charging stations, but that's specifically the ability to charge a vehicle. So that's why I say chargers. And the barriers we see to installing charging stations are primarily, and I believe it was Celia from Siemens who mentioned, and I think the only one who really specifically stated in the last panel, that these are construction projects. And so the barrier is not just purchasing the charging station and the technology that you have to choose associated with that station, but the installation of it and getting electricity to that station. It's expensive. It costs, in many situations, a lot of money. We are in Vermont, and we're dealing with an aging grid and an aging infrastructure. And so when you dive into actually putting in a station and getting electricity out to that station, in many situations, you're going to have to pay for an upgrade to that electrical infrastructure somewhere along the way, as well as actually get electricity from point A to point B. The other primary issue that we find is that we like to combine public stations with our fleet dedicated stations, and network stations are more expensive, and well, this is just an issue for state government. We have no authority to charge for charging. We're working on that in the upcoming legislative session, but we just can't make whole the cost to taxpayers if public entities are using our electricity to charge their vehicles. And then along with that is also the issue with ensuring that those who are using electricity are doing it a one-to-one for the rate that we pay for that electricity. And of course, I think that's one of the larger issues that we should be discussing here today, is that the rate structure by which we pay for electricity needs to be the same that we can charge those who are using our electricity. So ensuring that is synced up, and all in there.
Great. Thank you, Dan. I'm going to mix around a little bit. I'm going to go to Jennifer Bosco from the National Consumer Law Center. Thank you very much for being here.
Thank you.
That was Dan Steiner.
Oh.
You're good.
Thought maybe there was exciting news. So, hi, I'm Jennifer Bosco. I'm a staff attorney at the National Consumer Law Center, and we're based in Boston. We also have a Washington, D.C. office, and we are a nonprofit organization that advocates for consumer justice and economic security for low-income consumers and other disadvantaged groups. And we have a team of several attorneys who work on energy and utility issues, and in that group we also work on transportation electrification issues as well. So I'm going to talk a little more broadly, I guess, about consumer issues that relate to EV ownership and also EV infrastructure investment. And while my focus is on low-income consumers, a lot of it will be more broadly applicable to all consumers. And hopefully I can keep it to the 5 minutes. So for all consumers, but particularly low-income consumers, the shift to EVs presents a lot of potential benefits that we seek for lower income consumers, and some of those were touched on earlier. The lower cost of ownership and operation of electric vehicles, the possibility for more transportation options, the possibility for lower electric rates, especially if managed charging takes place, and the environmental and public health benefits. The electric rate piece is particularly important to our low-income clients, since low-income consumers already struggle with affordability and energy insecurity, and according to recent reports from U.S. Energy Information Administration, almost a third of U.S. households report difficulty paying utility bills or keeping their homes heated or cooled to a safe level because of affordability. So risks for low-income consumers also include the possibility that benefits will not be shared equitably among all consumers, and also the risk that in the short term, as utilities invest in infrastructure, there could be kind of the opposite effect on electric rates, where rates go up as a result of those investments. And so EV infrastructure investment should be pursued in a way that's going to lessen the impact on ratepayers and shield struggling low-income consumers from unaffordable rate increases, while at the same time providing sufficient infrastructure to support this transition to electric vehicles. So utility investments should be limited to those that are in the public interest and would not otherwise be undertaken by private investors. And we should look at fair rate design methods, enhanced discount rates, and bill payment assistance programs where those could be expanded to shield low and moderate income consumers from rate increases if those occur. And I know Vermont has some very strong programs already, but there might be ways to tweak those to accommodate low-income EV drivers. And fortunately, so far, a lot of the states that have looked at this have predicted relatively small rate impacts, at least at this initial stage. In addition to rate impacts, another concern is that low-income consumers may need enhanced protections from electricity shutoff in the event that they are in that 80% group who charges at home and start to experience a financial hardship and struggle to pay their utility bills. If that household loses their electricity, they haven't just lost the household uses, then they've also lost their transportation. So that might be another protection to look at as well and see where that can be strengthened. In terms of ownership issues, there are some barriers for low-income consumers and other consumers. Currently, the average vehicle age in the U.S. is over 11 years old, which indicates how long consumers hold on to their cars and how this might not be a fast transition for a lot of consumers, especially for lower-income consumers who tend to have older vehicles. Lower-income consumers generally are a lot more likely to completely lack access to a vehicle in the first place, and that is even more pronounced for low-income consumers who are people of color. So that's the context, but also EV ownership has many potential benefits for low-income consumers, at least that we hope to see, that I touched on before: the lower cost of ownership and maintenance. We know that used EVs are becoming more and more affordable, and I know there are the purchase incentives here in Vermont. California and Oregon have provided enhanced rebates for low-income consumers there, where there's a rebate that everyone can qualify for. But if you prove that you're income eligible, you can get an additional rebate, which may be helpful for low-income consumers as well. And it's a better structure than tax incentives, because a lot of lower-income consumers are not going to be able to take advantage of tax credits and tax incentives in the same way that higher-income consumers would. So non-ownership alternatives in some areas and some communities may also be a better way to spread the benefits of transportation electrification to low-income people through electrifying public transit or school buses, subsidized car sharing programs, which are being piloted in some parts of California, and that in some instances the best way to determine what the needs of different low-income communities are is to really work with those communities and community organizations to do mobility needs assessments, which have been undertaken, and there are models for doing that, to really determine the transportation needs of low-income consumers. So, thanks.
Thank you. All right, let's go down to the end of the table now and go to Josh Cassengay from Green Mountain Power.
Thanks, Peter. So again, my name is Josh Cassengay. I'm with Green Mountain Power. So I'll just quickly hit some of the things that we've been doing, what we've seen as potential barriers, and the things that we've been working on to help overcome some of those. Our focus of recent has been much more in the home charging space. I think we've seen, somebody had a stat earlier, that's where a majority of the charging happens for customers now when they procure an EV. A lot of it is at home. And some of the questions that we had heard early on are things such as, well, I'm buying this thing now, what's it going to cost me in electricity to charge this? So some pilots that we're running around that are, one, providing a free level 2 in-home charger, which I think as Brian and some of the other folks have hit, it's a way to charge a little more quickly at home, in exchange for sharing access with GMP for that demand control peak management time. The other component of that is a fixed cost for charging. Right now it's $30 a month, and that's essentially all you can charge. And that sort of sets the idea there is to take away some of the questions of what's it going to cost. That fixes the price, and it's based on data we currently have through a number of programs, such as the technical advisory group that was done for Tier 3 work, as well as some other information from Drive Electric and others on what these cars are using for consumption. That actually also works out to be a bit of a discount to what you would otherwise pay on average, because of the fact that you're sharing access with us to control during those peak times. There's other, more traditional routes, like just straight time of use, where a customer can get on a time of use rate and shift their charging around the on and off peak periods. Again, our focus has been to try to make it as simple and painless as possible for customers as we roll any of these things out. So the idea that not having them have to think about it, but being able to plug in, charge, we can adjust charging during peak times. Customer always has the ability to override if, for whatever reason, they need to crank it up and get out of there earlier than expected. We have some of the focus on, low income has been mentioned. We have an additional rebate basically for low to moderate income qualified customers that are procuring EVs. Thanks to the current renewable energy standard, that's helped us to provide some of these charging and this charging infrastructure to home customers. The other piece we started a little earlier on is more in the public charging infrastructure space, and partnered up with folks to deploy level 2 and fast DC chargers that were discussed earlier around the state. As I mentioned, we've shifted to thinking about more in the home and potentially in the business and partnering with folks. But that was, it was helpful to get some of the chicken and egg question, get some infrastructure in the ground to start helping to alleviate any range anxiety that was going on there. But again, now we're seeing with the range of cars they're having, with a lot of charging happening at home and a lot at work, that's starting to kind of reduce itself as a concern with consumers getting EVs. Those are the big ones that we're focused on right now. From a grid infrastructure standpoint, I will just say that total energy consumption wise, it doesn't, we've run it at 30, 40,000 EVs over the next 5 to 10 years. That doesn't raise a major flag from an energy standpoint, with the caveat that the shared access on charging infrastructure is a piece of that to help manage those peak times, and then to further leverage, there's a potential to actually to further save costs on the system, or in the various markets like in ISO New England, with enough aggregate of resources like that, you can actually participate in certain things to benefit all customers. So that's quick nutshell of what GMP's had going on.
Thank you, Josh. We will now go to Sandy Levine from the Conservation Law Foundation to hear another perspective.
Hey. Thanks so much. I'm Sandra Levine. I'm a senior attorney with the Conservation Law Foundation. And we've been working on electric vehicle issues for a number of years as part of our work on reducing greenhouse gas emissions. And our work on these issues is in all of the New England states, and that's the perspective I bring. With a 5-minute summary, I'm not going to be able to go into all of the matters. I'll provide additional comments after the fact, but I'll certainly highlight some of them. But to start out, so why CLF is here, and I have a handout that's available, and this was referenced before, but our recent greenhouse gas inventory shows that at a time when we should be about 20% below our greenhouse gas emissions from 1990, we're actually 16% above that. And particularly in Vermont, transportation is the largest contributor of greenhouse gas emissions in Vermont. So there's a lot of room for improvement, a lot of opportunities to get to where we need to be going, and certainly tackling the transportation sector is important. I'm here also representing consumer interests, which are very much a part of environmental interests. Low-income communities across the globe suffer more from climate change impacts and more broadly from the negative use of industrialization and fossil fuel use. If vehicle electrification becomes a solution that's only available to the wealthy, it will fail. We'll not achieve the goals that we've set out to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and provide a clean environment for ourselves and our future generations. So addressing consumer interests and equity are hallmarks of a successful program. And in Vermont, we really have an opportunity to build on the success that we've already seen with energy efficiency, where we've set aside a certain amount of investments and a certain percentage of participation that will go to low and moderate income families and communities. We can build on that, and that should be the feature of a broad participation going forward is really critical. I think those same features should be in place for electric vehicles and the programs that we have in place and the incentives that we have for electric vehicles. In terms of barriers, very broadly, and others have mentioned this, it's cost, access, and convenience. Conservation Law Foundation has a report. There's some copies available here. More available on our website and with the PUC. We've put this together with Conservation Law Foundation, Sierra Club, and Acadia Center back in 2015. I wish I could say that this report is dated. We've achieved everything we set out to do in 2015. Unfortunately, I think it's probably more prescient than it is dated. In terms of cost, the cost of the car, maintenance, operation, how does it compare to other options? Access, do I have access to everything? Do I have all models to meet the needs? And convenience. Where can I service this car? How much service do I need? Where can I charge it? How do I charge it? As we've seen with other disruptions, if something meets a need better, we're more willing to move on and adapt to that. I think most of this is probably obvious. Anyone who's shopped for a car in Vermont has probably looked at an EV and maybe decided, yeah, this doesn't really meet my needs now, I hope it does in the future, or it does meet my needs now. Great, and we've adopted the EVs. I think we'd have a very different conversation in Vermont if when any consumer went to a dealership and saw that half of the vehicles on the lot were EVs, and that there were models available comparable to all the gas-powered vehicles. That's not what we're seeing. In some jest, I'll say it should be easier in Vermont. Everybody drives either a Honda, a Subaru, or a Toyota. So we only really have 3 models to deal with. But they were not really seeing a lot of electric vehicle opportunities there. Nissan and GM, there's a great opportunity there, get more market share. Strategies to address. And again, these are highlighted in the report that Conservation Law Foundation put out. I won't go into them in detail. They include state-level leadership. Where are the incentives that we're doing? And there are huge opportunities for improving the state fleet and for automaker incentives. And incentives, it's not always just an opportunity it's not always that you need to pay more money, though we certainly have incentives out there. Greater use of parking preferences, high occupancy vehicle lanes. We don't have those in Vermont. Vehicle registration. State parking is a largely underutilized incentive. Priority for electric vehicles could be there. Utility rates have been talked about some, and I commend Green Mountain Power for incorporating load control. Those are benefits to the entire grid and improving grid modernization. There's also opportunities to incorporate electric vehicles with Efficiency Vermont. An electric vehicle is an electric motor and should be part of our electric efficiency delivery. And finally, two more matters, piloting secondary markets for used electric vehicles, make them available in a broad program, particularly for low-income consumers, to lease EVs, to have an all-in payment subscription service. I think those could be really beneficial for low-income consumers and a real positive opportunity for them. In terms of having additional money available for incentives, we can build on what's already in place with the Volkswagen settlement that we have, and also build on RGGI and build on the opportunities we have for carbon pricing at a state or regional level going forward. Thanks so much.
And last but not least, Darren Springer from the Burlington Electric Department.
All right. Thank you, Peter, and thank you, commissioners, for having me. In Burlington, we're working towards a net zero energy city goal across ground transportation, heating, and electricity. So EVs present a really unique opportunity for us to reduce fossil fuel use in the transportation sector. And we're pursuing a multi-pronged approach when it comes to electrifying transportation. We've partnered with Green Mountain Transit to deploy up to 4 electric buses coming in 2019 that'll run from Burlington and through the commuter patterns that the GMT currently runs. And that was through incentives via the Tier 3 program from the Vermont Renewable Energy Standard. We've got a EV rebate of $1,200 for a full EV, $600 for plug-in hybrids, and then $1,800 for qualified low moderate income consumers, which I think is the most generous program in the state, as far as I'm aware. And we also are partnering with 3 credit unions to offer financing, taking advantage of that rebate and providing lower interest loans to get consumers access to financing and have the value of the rebate up front as opposed to being a mail-in rebate, so it helps at the point of sale. And we've also found that there's a lot of interest in electric bikes for commuting. And so we have a program going now with, I think, 5 of our local bicycle shops where we're getting electric bikes deployed in Burlington, and we're seeing people use them to replace automobile trips. And we see that as an interesting part of the future in a relatively urban and more dense, compact land use environment that we have in Burlington. We are seeing the benefit of utility leadership, I think, in this space as a result of some of these initiatives. And we also have taken it a step further, and I want to thank the Commission and the Department for their support of our electric vehicle rate, which will be rolling out soon, which has been approved, which will offer off-peak charging rate to residential consumers. And the benefit for us is that we'll be able to drive more of this charging, a lot of which has been mentioned is taking place at the home, into our off-peak hours where we have very adequate capacity to handle it. And the key point, I think, there, and I think Sandy touched on it, Josh touched on it, if we can manage the charging such that we can get it off-peak as opposed to exacerbating peak, there is a benefit for every ratepayer regardless of whether they are driving an EV or not, because those additional kilowatt hours are going to benefit the system, make our grid more efficient. And we're not necessarily interested just in selling more kilowatt hours. We've run a very successful efficiency program in Burlington. We use 4% less electricity today than we did in 1989. We are interested in those additional kilowatt hours coming off-peak, benefiting all ratepayers, and being for things like beneficial electrification that can lower emissions and fossil fuel use. So our new residential rate will help in that regard. We also have 14 public charging stations with 26 ports that we run and have invested in from Burlington Electric. They're not as highly utilized as they probably could be, but we're seeing the growth steady at those stations, and we have some that are more popular than others. And it's interesting to look at the mix of out-of-town visitors who use them versus in-town. We see a role for workplace charging as well. We're seeing a lot of that in Burlington. I guess the 2 points I would focus on as it relates to not only this panel, but perhaps the entire proceeding is in terms of charging, we certainly see a big role, continued large role for residential off-peak charging and for other off-peak charging. To the extent that we see new investment in public charging stations, whether they're publicly managed or privately managed, we need to have the ability as a utility to work to manage the peak issue there. We have requirements on us via the Tier 3 program and others to put in place best demand management practices for any electric vehicle charging or other initiatives that we launch under that program. We want to make sure that any regulatory changes that might come as a result of this proceeding would incorporate the ability for utilities to partner to have best demand management practices with any new investments. The other item I just wanted to mention is with our public charging stations, we have a transparent tariffed rate that you can look at on our website. That's a per kilowatt hour rate that a customer can pay. And if they stay in the parking space for more than 4 hours, there's an additional charge related to that. But for a customer who comes in and charges at one of our charging stations, they pay a per kilowatt hour rate, and it's transparent. And I think that if there are any changes relative to the structure of EV charging, that we need to ensure that we continue to have a transparent and stable rate so that consumers can benefit. I don't think we want to go to a gas station model when it comes to EV charging and have rates that are non-transparent and variable and that potentially don't benefit the consumer. We see a huge consumer benefit in terms of charging electric vehicles compared to operating a gasoline vehicle, and we want to see that continue. So just in summary, from Burlington Electric standpoint, we see a real leadership role for utilities to partner here, and we're grateful for the opportunity.
Great. Thank you to all the panelists. I think you've heard a lot of things here, commissioners, on what stands in the way. It's all tied together. The vehicles and the charging infrastructure are inextricably linked. Ultimately, the goal is to get to the use of the vehicles, but within that, you have to have the charging infrastructure both at home and out and about to be able to make that happen. We've heard, Dave Roberts told us earlier about the sort of changing nature of what stands in the way of people wanting to buy electric vehicles. It used to be a huge issue around range anxiety and where can I charge and all those things. We're starting to see that fade as we get more and more vehicles that have comparable ranges to an internal combustion engine. Those things are changing. But the cost structures, even with the incentives in place and the federal tax credit, you see this sort of sticker shock still having an effect. And I think it's lack of knowledge. I think it's lack of sort of understanding of the whole pricing model. We've gotten into, we've developed this internal combustion based automobile system based on generally cheap fuel, and the major price of the car, people's primary concerns was the upfront cost. That model is now switching, and we have to develop better ways to be able to communicate that to consumers. I wish we had on this panel, we could have great voices from some of the local dealers who have started to make the transition and started to figure out how to sell these vehicles and how to communicate how to sell these vehicles, because we're at the point now where many consumers will walk into a dealership and know more about the vehicle than a dealer does, because the dealer's not selling very many of them. And the consumer is making an intentional choice. They're coming in to look at the Leaf. They're coming in to look at the Bolt. They're coming in to look at whatever vehicle it may be. And it may be because they just heard about this $10,000 incentive that went into place last year, what have you. But they're doing their research up front. And so we have to figure out how to match that sort of, to bring those two sides together to make that model work. Some of these may be outside of your scope, but I would love you to keep these thoughts in mind as you're going about your work. We talked about cost, we talked about charging. I think the issues related to low income protections are huge. Within that, I think we have not given enough focus to the used electric vehicle market. There are barriers there that we have that people have questions about because we just don't really know how it's going to work. It's relatively new. Most of our EVs that are on lease right now are leaving the state to go to used markets elsewhere. And there's a question of when the battery runs out of its useful life, what happens next? And so there are models that people need to sort of to become more comfortable with for that to work. Most vehicles in Vermont are not purchased new. And so that's a market that we have. If we're going to create the penetration that we need to, we have to see that work. And I would counter something Sadie said just a little bit to say that I think most of the vehicles in Vermont are either F-150s or Outbacks, Subaru Outbacks. And so when we see that sort of market penetration from those two, we'll be okay. But I think both of them are actually on pace to either be plug-in hybrid or full electric. I'm excited to get into some questions and answers with this panel because they're really engaging into this discussion. I have a few sort of off the back that anybody can answer. And maybe I'm going to ask the first to the utility folks. What sort of out-in-town charging penetration do you think will really need to see for electric vehicle, for that part of the sort of the, I'll call it sort of the convenience puzzle for people to sort of get beyond that having that linger in people's mind.
Sorry, did you say, what was the first part?
So what level of, so we've talked about at-home charging, we've talked about workplace charging, which are going to be two huge features, but what seems to drive most people's concerns are the 1% of their trips that aren't to and from work or about and around town. So it's that question that gets them they have people concerned about where they're charging, where the range effects come to play. So if you guys thought about anything about what it looks like to have sort of a fully, so say for 30,000 vehicles, what it would take to get people to feel comfortable with the charging infrastructure that's out there?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, I think, equally as important as again, my opinion, there's a lot of better expertise in the room around this stuff, but as you start to move out of home and business, workplace charging, it becomes much more about speed, I would think, and hearing about some of the technological advances of ultra fast and where things are going, to me, speed of charging, as you're really thinking more about, like, what if Vermont is a commuter route from Canada to southern New England or something, where are people stopping to charge along the way? Surprisingly, as you look at charging, I know the Ad Energy team knows this, across, from Quebec to New Brunswick, there's an amazing amount of usage on the charging infrastructure up there. And there's a lot of fast charging infrastructure that gets used quite often. So it's hard for me to say what is the right amount. I think it's probably not, I mean, yeah, it's I don't know, it's probably not that many. It's the right locations, but it's speed of charging that's going to be much more important in the evolution of I guess it's the cars as well as the charging infrastructure to get there.
I would say that, we know that a number of trips are made daily that are well under the range that an electric vehicle could offer, and in many cases even a plug-in hybrid vehicle. In our experience, I think a lot of the public charging station use is coming from visitors, which we certainly encourage. We want folks to come and visit Burlington and shop and then charge their vehicle as they come. So I think it's important to have some capacity there, but in the near term at least, I think we see a continued focus on at-home charging, on workplace charging, so that if somebody's coming to work and they need to charge during the day to get home on electric, that they have the ability to do that. I think we're playing an important role in creating the corridor that we need in Vermont to have folks be having the confidence to be able to travel, whether it's from Burlington to Boston or Montreal to Burlington to Boston. We want to make sure that capacity is available, but I don't know that we'll necessarily need a massive build out there in the near future. And one just anecdote I wanted to share, and I know Robert Miller from Nissan was going to be on the panel. I don't see him, but we worked with him, as did Green Mountain Power and other utilities, to offer a pretty significant rebate on the outgoing Nissan Leaf model, the prior model, which only had 120 miles of range, I think, in the latest iteration prior to the new model. Okay, well, there we go. We got an expert in the room. But it was not a range of 200 or 300 miles. And I believe that dealership, coupled with some utility partnership in terms of incentives, moved more Nissan Leafs in the month of July, if I recall correctly, on a raw basis, not a per capita basis, than any other in the country outside of one community, which I think was in the West Coast area. So I think we saw that although there is the chicken and egg issue, if the price comes down enough and people feel like there's a really good deal on the table, they'll take it, regardless of range, regardless of range anxiety.
Thanks. I have a question for Jen. Maybe you could answer this. It's about how we deal with creating demand for people who are who might not have access to their own. They're not paying their utility bill. They're living in multifamily housing. How do we speak specifically to that market and expand opportunities there?
I know I'm trying to remember who, there was a mention earlier about kind of the need for charging infrastructure in multifamily housing, and I know that's there have been some challenges around that because there's not always a great business case for putting charging infrastructure in multifamily housing. So that's kind of one of the areas that there might be a need for utility support of that. And if the charging is available in the place that most people would use the charging, that might be one way to encourage it. And there may be certainly opportunities for community education as well. I think that a lot of people don't necessarily realize that it's potentially a lot cheaper to own an electric vehicle than a regular gas-fueled vehicle. And by encouraging lower income people and teaching them this and making it easier for them to become owners, then we can possibly avoid creating this two-tiered transportation system where low income people are kind of the last ones driving fossil fueled vehicles. But so I think, making charging available, education, making it a good deal, finding ways to make this affordable.
I would just add to that I think there are opportunities to explore in a subscription model, particularly for the used EVs, where I think some of the concern is how long is this EV going to be around and available, and how long is this battery going to work? A lot of people, myself included, keep a car for 10 years. I'm not sure that the EV cars 10 years from now are going to be the state of the art. But if you can provide, particularly for low income, a subscription service at a reasonable cost that's comparable to what they would otherwise be paying, and bundle the benefits that you're getting there, both the grid benefits, the health benefits, the air pollution benefits, into the cost of that, I think there's real opportunities there.
That's really helpful. So then I have a follow-up question for you, Sandy, because one of the points that we've made is that electric vehicles are one of the tools that we have to combat the transportation emissions. There will be other issues related to liquid renewable fuels. There will be simply driving less and having more electric bikes and regular bikes and walking around. Where, in your mind, where does the electric vehicle adoption fit into the overall picture?
The electric vehicle adoption should fit into the picture where other opportunities are not available, whether they be public transportation, more bicycle, more opportunities for either bicycling, electric scooters, or electric bicycles, or walking. There will still be some times where people have to get in a car and go somewhere. And for all of those uses going forward, particularly as we're looking to meeting our greenhouse gas reduction requirements, all or a majority of those need to be electric and electrified. I think there are opportunities on the state level for more public transit, for more school buses. Kids all around Vermont are getting on school buses every day. More and more of those need to be electric going forward.
Can I just add
Sure.
one other thing real quick? I think, for people buying used vehicles, if they knew that there was potentially another use for the battery when it's worn out, and I know there'd been a brief mention of that, and maybe that would be a better question for the emerging technology panel. But, to the extent that there are secondary uses for a battery, then buying a used vehicle maybe doesn't feel like as much of a risk, because then you don't feel like you're going to be stuck with a worthless, but, initially kind of pricey battery.
Commissioners, I think we've asked and answered some good questions. We'd like to hear what you'd like to ask the panel.
Thank you. We've heard about EVs work with Vermont Transit for buses. I also see fleet vehicles, school buses, but also the UPS, FedEx as kind of groundbreaking things where you have a big company willing to invest in this technology. And I didn't know, I'll start with just GMP and DED, but anybody can chime in. Are you having conversations with any of those fleets and how to get around peak issues or demand charge issues, that kind of thing?
So we've had, not specifically with the like the UPS or FedEx, we've had conversations with similar transit companies. We have a couple buses, I believe, Dave and others coming to Montpelier in the next year or so, with some help from PW funds and partnership with VTrans. But we did. One of the interesting things that came up when we discussed school buses with some of the school boards, as well as in Rutland, the transit authority there, was the timing, kind of the nice timing of when the routes are versus when the peaks are. They don't necessarily correspond, which is a good thing, and we have the ability to manage charging. One of the other pieces that has been more interesting to me, I haven't been as bullish on vehicle to grid in the residential commuter space, meaning using the battery to actually discharge to help the grid versus just managing charging. On the larger transit space, it's a little more interesting. You have beefier systems, more energy storage on the bus, and the potential with the right charging infrastructure to leverage that a little bit more. So that's where our conversations have been going. But the charging infrastructure is a whole step above, obviously, in terms of cost and work you have to do.
And I would say we haven't had any conversations with the companies that you mentioned, although I think we'd be open to it if they were interested in working with us. When it comes to the buses, one of the key things for us is that Green Mountain Transit was going to look at the long-haul buses, the battery capacity adequate to make it through all of their routes during the day and then come back to Burlington and charge at off-peak hours overnight. And there are other buses that charge on a more frequent basis, including during the day, that would potentially have more of an impact on peak, but we're not looking at those in Burlington. We're looking at the long hauls. And the battery technology, we had a few companies that came and tested buses in Burlington and had a chance to ride on them. The technology is very good. They were able to handle all the different routes, and I think in testing, at least one company had one of these buses go for 1,100 miles with one single charge. I don't think that's what's typical, but they can very typically go for 300-400 miles during a day before needing to charge overnight. So that technology has come to a point where it can work with off-peak charging.
Actually, I want to just, Darren reminded me of one quick thing in terms of, we talk about peak and off-peak. It's important to know now that the peak in Vermont is typically, evening hours, 6, 7, 8, 9 p.m. So actually, again, this is where school buses are interesting, because charging in the middle of the day with the abundance of PV that we have in the system is a really good thing. It's counterintuitive to the past of what used to be considered on-peak energy, but depending on where you're at, that's a benefit to the system soaking up some of that energy in the middle of the day. I just wanted to point that out.
So we've started talking about fleets and municipal entities, state, BGS, and the opportunities for cities. And I think what they all have in common is many of these vehicles have the highest emissions. So targeting them can have some immediate, faster benefit. Number two, they tend to drive in smaller circles than the typical Vermont commuter. And three, they can potentially charge in one place during the day for buses, late at night for, say, UPS. We know that UPS has a goal of going all electric. We heard that at an EV convention we went to last month. And so in terms of the cost-benefit analysis, do you think more could be done to educate on the long-term benefits, mostly on savings? New Bedford, Massachusetts decided several years ago to go to all electric for their fleet because it saved them so much money. I guess this is partly a question for BGS and partly for people who are working in the urban space. Is enough being done to look at that larger calculation, the long-term savings, as opposed to the short-term expenditure? And what else can we do to help make that clear?
I might kick this off and then hand it to Dan. I think you've raised an interesting point, because the economic calculation is fairly simple. And it takes maybe a special financing package to get there for all consumers, whether they be municipal, fleet owners, or individuals. But the economics are there now, and as the price of batteries comes down, and so the price comparability between an internal combustion engine and an electric vehicle is right on par, which we expect sort of in the next 5 years. So we're really talking about trying to put our foot on the gas. Sorry to use a bad term there. Now is to leverage more of those cost savings for consumers, right? Because we need to get there faster for greenhouse gas emission purposes, but we also, the longer you own a vehicle, the sooner we get people in them, the more they can generate those savings. And so the education and the understanding piece and the comfort piece is a huge part of it for the consumers.
Well, I agree with what Peter said. I think it depends on how you look at the life cycle cost-benefit analysis. We typically hold on to our vehicles for 4.
Can you just keep your voice up, please?
Sorry. It depends on how you look at the life cycle cost-benefit analysis. we typically hold on to our vehicles for 4 years. We don't have enough data in terms of resale value on our EVs yet to incorporate that dollar value into our analysis. But the cost of infrastructure for the state and the cost to taxpayers is significant. And so from what we're seeing right now, it's not a slam dunk or a home run to say, oh yes, EVs are by far more beneficial, specifically on a cost analysis basis. So you do have to build in the environmental externalities into that analysis. Yeah, so more to come on that front. I do think that it's important to note, though, that like all of our charging stations right now that are dedicated to fleet do not have the ability to load shed or reduce the impact on the grid during peak times. And so to require that technology when designing an installation is paramount in terms of moving forward in the future and ensuring that we don't have a negative impact.
This is very specific to BGS. Sorry.
It's okay.
Are you looking at putting more? It sounds like there are expenses to putting chargers in state lots. I do think it would be a big benefit. I think combined with Sandy Levine's idea that you have maybe a preferential parking around here, that would make me buy an electric vehicle today. But is BGS planning more in the state lots?
Yeah, absolutely. We have depending on how it pans out with ADA compatibility, we're looking at in the very near future putting in an additional 16 charging stations here in Montpelier. But something that's important to consider is that we have to first look at fleet dedicated charging, and then once we meet that requirement, then we can also incorporate the opportunity to put in some public stations as well. I get calls every day saying, when are we going to get more charging stations here, there, and everywhere? So there definitely is a demand for it. How we do it and make sure that we're doing it in the best interest of all taxpayers is a far more complicated process. And so we're just starting on that road now. And obviously this discussion is part of it. But moving forward, how do we ensure that we're not, as the state, doing it a disservice? But we certainly are moving forward with more charging stations. Yeah.
Follow-up question. When you say you're getting calls every day asking where are they, when will they come, are those questions from state employees?
Those questions are primarily from state employees and the traveling public. Our fleet users are well taken care of. But we definitely have seen that the request for EVs within state government while traveling has led to the installation of more dedicated fleet charging as well. But yeah, the questions about where is our charging is from the public and state employees for their own personal vehicles. And my response typically is, without legislative authority, I can't put a charging station in for you to charge your own vehicle. Yeah.
Any questions from the audience? Dan?
Hi, Dan Cotton with UCS.
If it's possible, I suggest that you could take the time to go up to the microphone. That would make it easier for us all to hear. Yeah, about the podium. Thank you very much.
Sorry, that was a lot of wind up for a small question. My name is Daniel Gotti. I'm with UCS, and I'm on the next panel too. I just was curious from the Green Mountain Power perspective. You know, I'm very intrigued by your system. I'm curious what the customer reaction is. If there have been challenges in terms of customers, you know, not being prepared for off-peak events, and you know, maybe more generally, whether you see sort of direct utility management of charging infrastructure in that way as being an alternative to, you know, advanced metering infrastructure and time of use rates, or as being something that would work together with other kinds of rate design.
Sure. Well, so to your first question, I mean, honestly, when we did the pilot, one of the concerns was, okay, you know, we're going to have a peak event, charge is going to turn down, and then customers are first going to start realizing it and have concerns, and everyone's going to override. And like, surprisingly, amazingly, like, I think we've seen, so we've been running it since December. We're up to a couple hundred customers in it now, and maybe have had one override during a peak event. And to be clear, we're talking about, you know, 3 to 5 times a month typically that we're doing an event like that. So that hasn't come up as a large concern. Now, what I will say though, to your second question, I think it's just providing options is key. So I think they do kind of go together. You're going to have some customers who just prefer to kind of manage it themselves, use a time of use rate, an off-peak rate, and that flexibility is there. And you're going to have a chunk of customers who don't want to have to think about it, want to get the EV, just want to know that, you know, getting the best deal they can, plug in and have nothing to do with timing the charging, and that option's there. So I think both are going to have to exist together.
We have time for one more quick question. If you can come up to the podium quickly. We'll see.
Hi, my name is Peter O'Connor. I'm with Plug in America. This is for the utility folks. In workplace charging, do you see any adoption of level 1 that can replenish like 30 to 40 miles in a workday, which is a commute, and it's much cheaper to install? And do you see any use of that, or is it all level 2 in workplaces?
I think as far as we're aware, mostly we're seeing level 2, but I tend to agree with you that there's a role for level 1, or what's referred to as trickle charging, whether it's at the workplace or particularly even off-peak residential charging as well. And one of the things we're working on is making sure that the off-peak rate that we're offering for residential customers, certainly it'll be available with a level 2, but we're looking at the technology to make it available if somebody has a plug-in hybrid and comes home and just wants to plug into an outlet, doesn't want to make the investment in level 2. We're looking at all the different technologies that might enable us to empower them to have the rate as well.
I could just add to that we're seeing that in some locations in rural Vermont, EV drivers are more willing to move vehicles and let someone else come in at the workplace, and so we can get more bang for our buck with level 2 in those locations. And then more populated areas like downtown Montpelier, folks aren't as willing to move their vehicles, and so trickle charging would be more beneficial.
I'm going to go to Riley Allen had a question, and I think we have a minute, so we'll try to.
This event is kind of organized by regulators, and they're one of the important audiences to this panel the entire day. And I just want to throw out a question broadly to the group on what specifically would you ask or want to prepare the regulators or regulatory community or by way of barriers or strategies going forward. I know we've heard from Burlington Electric that they've offered an electric vehicle rate. I think they've emphasized things like transparency, but I just want to make sure that we've taken full advantage of the experts that we have in front of us to kind of call out the things that might be coming before the Commission and the Department to think about as we think about the regulatory environment going forward. Thank you.
I think this probably gets a little more towards the charging panel, which is the next one, but fundamentally not limiting access to charging. Expanding the opportunities to more than just electric utilities to sell kilowatt hours so that everybody can charge whenever they want. Encouraging more of the sharing economy. Basically, every outlet in this state is a gas station. And there are a lot of outlets in this state, and those should be made as available as possible to every consumer in the state.
I'd add one thought. I think that to Sandy's point, we've had a good, successful run with vertically integrated, regulated utilities, and I think that this area, as an emerging area, creates some interesting questions around whether it's the resale of kilowatt hours or how we manage private investment in charging versus public investment. I know other states have grappled with that as well, and I think from the Burlington Electric perspective, certainly we'd be glad to weigh in further at the right moment in time, but having a partnership model that preserves the role of the utility in offering programs and incentives and having a role to play, I think has a benefit, and I think that's been borne out in other states like California and elsewhere.
I think with that, thank you. That was a great question, Riley, because it kind of sums up where we are. This panel really looks at the broad topic, but it tries to put it into focus for the commissioners to be able to think through what issues are going to come up. All of them, a lot of the issues you'll deal with are about charging and infrastructure and rates, but it all comes down to that has to be in the mix with the consumer part of it to figure out how we get people to drive them on the roads. So thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you to everyone. And this panel will, as you'll see, overlap a little with the next one. They're both about barriers and strategies. This one technically was about barriers and strategies for deployment of electric cars. Of course, it's hard to separate the two. The next one officially is focusing more on the charging infrastructure, but I'm sure we'll hear overlap there as well. So we'll start again at 11:35. That gives us about 10 minutes for break.
Thank you all.
Thanks, Peter.